Chapter 16. John lowered his weapon and pointed the barrel down at the ground. Cameron followed his example and let her own battle rifle hang at her side, though she knew she could grasp it and fire accurately from the hip in less than 1 second if it became necessary. She still stared at Allison curiously. Was she similar to the Allison she'd met in her original timeline? She'd seen already that people weren't the same. John wasn't the same as future John, although he was learning fast. How different was this Allison? Ellison stood up off the ground and picked up his machine gun, making sure the barrel wasn't pointed at them. Savannah kept her weapon drawn for a moment, hesitating just like Allison had, but she relented without having to be told. Besides, she thought, if they were going to try and start anything, they'd have Cameron and her to contend with. And the ginger bitch. She glowered at the last thought. John turned to Derek and looked him straight in the eye. Everything I told you before, about me, Cameron, the past, it's all true. Derek almost rolled his eyes in frustration. Don't jerk us around, he said curtly. He's telling you the truth, Ellison replied. And who are you? Mac asked. You part of his group too. He jerked his head at John. The ones who have been kicking the crap out of Skynet. What? Ellison stared at him in confusion. What group? That was me, Cameron said. Technically, it was true, as John Henry was a part of her. They were the same now. Allison stared at Cameron with contempt, almost mirroring Savannah's feelings towards Weaver. You're just a machine, she spat, curling her fist into a ball in anger. I'm more than you think, Cameron replied. John stepped between them, afraid a fight was about to start and knowing exactly how it would end if it kicked off. That was Cameron, but it's gone now. Skynet destroyed it all. Always happens, Kyle shrugged. Nobody lasts long against Skynet. You guys probably did better than anyone else in the last 5 years or so, he added. Thank you, Cameron said politely. Anyway, John tried to get them back on topic. I'm from the past. Ellison and Savannah here knew me back in 2009. I was an FBI agent assigned to the Connor case, Ellison added. You mean Sarah Connor? Mac asked. The one on the news they thought blew herself up in a bank and then got arrested 9 years later. That was my mom, John nodded. Mac could hardly suppress a grin as he remembered it all. The most wanted domestic terrorist in America, broke out of jail and escaped without a trace. You remember that, Reese? Ironic she'd been right all along, he thought. Derek shook his head. I was 13 at the time, didn't really watch the news. He'd never heard of any Sarah Connor before. Mac forgot that he was the old man of their group. He'd been 25 at the time. She thought machines were going to take over the world, blew up 2 computer factories trying to stop it. Back to the here and now, Derek said to Mac, bringing him back from the past. There's no way you could be from 2009, kid. You told us the same crap before. Why should I believe it now? A smirk appeared on John's face, and he tapped the barrel stock of his rifle. Think about it, he said to Derek. Last time I was your prisoner. Now we've got you at gunpoint. I don't need to lie to you. We could kill you easy. Weaver probably wants to, in fact. It would be easier, Weaver replied. We don't need them. John ignored her comment. Why did Cameron only ever kill threats, but Weaver would happily dice anyone that was even a mild inconvenience? But if Derek needed further convincing, then that's what he'd do, John decided. As I told you before, you and Kyle both love baseball. You were even playing it on Judgment Day when the missiles flew. He turned to Kyle. You thought they were fireworks. You both hid in the tunnels under City Hall. You'd heard about them in school. I already told you about the deer Derek killed. John thought about what else he could say to convince them. You both have type AB negative blood. How can you know all that? Derek asked, incredulous. He'd heard some of it before from John, but it was an unbelievable story. And at the time, the kid had been squirming to say anything that wouldn't incriminate him as a Gray. "Because I'm from the past," John said. "Because I knew you in another time, another life. He'd come back in time to help me and my mom stop Skynet. Everything I just told you came from him." Kyle stared at John, wondering how any of this could be true. Time travel couldn't be possible, could it? "What's more," John added, "we can prove it." Weaver had said the TDE was built into the walls and the floor. It should still be there. Savannah raised her rifle up to her hip, pointing it in their general direction. "What's more is that we've got the guns and you're gonna do as we damn well say," she told them. John saw her point. It didn't matter if they believed him or not when he could simply show them the TDE. "Weaver, take point. I'll take the rear," Savannah cut in before John could continue. Wherever Weaver was, she'd be the opposite end. "Where are we going?" Allison asked. "Back to where you found me," John replied. "Let's move." Weaver moved forward some distance ahead of the group, followed by Derek, Kyle, Allison, and Mac. Then John and Cameron, Ellison behind them, and Savannah brought up the rear. They took a side tunnel that led into the sewer, steering them away from the station platform and any chance of reinforcement coming to help Derek and the others. They continued on in silence for the most part. None of them felt much like socializing. Allison stared continuously at Cameron as they marched down the tunnels. The machine freaked her the hell out, and what was worse was the way John was clearly close to it. How they marched beside each other, and their shoulders or forearms would occasionally brush together, and the whispering that went on between them every now and again. Every time he muttered too low for her to hear a thing, his face softened slightly. She knew she was right. He was definitely fucking the tin can. "What's your story?" She spat out at Cameron, wanting to know what the hell she was about. "I was sent to protect John," Cameron replied. She kept her voice neutral, but she knew that she'd left him, abandoned him, and until 4 days ago hadn't been there to protect him. She'd failed, even if temporarily, and she wouldn't let it happen again. "In the other future, John sent me to keep him safe." "This big shot, John you claimed to be in another future?" Kyle asked. "Yes," Cameron said. "John's the last best hope for humans. He led the resistance against Skynet. Without him, Skynet would have won." "So how are you on his side?" Kyle asked. He'd never seen a machine that had turned against Skynet. "Forget that," Allison said impatiently. "I want to know why you look exactly like me." Cameron considered lying to her. She knew what Allison's response was likely to be if she told her the truth, but decided to anyway. She didn't see any reason to hide her past. They all knew what she was. "You were an intelligence officer in John's camp. Skynet built me in your image to infiltrate and kill him. John reprogrammed me, and now I fight for him." John turned his head and looked at her for a moment, a little confused. He could have sworn he'd heard a hint of pride in her voice as she'd spoken about fighting for him. "Great," Allison mumbled. "So what happened to me?" "I killed you." Allison's eyes opened wide as she took it all in. She could barely believe it all. "You're telling me that you're nothing to do with me. Was this all just some massive, terrible coincidence?" "Not you," Cameron assured her. That's something at least, Allison thought to herself. As long as the machine was telling the truth, at least. She didn't know what to think anymore. Eventually, after miles and miles of tunnels, and marching through patches of blackness, dank and dingy water, and constantly straining their ears to listen out for machines or any other threats, Weaver stopped and turned to them. "We're underneath Zyra Corp," she told them. John vaguely recognized the rough layout of the place from when he'd arrived. They filtered into the main basement through a large hole in the wall, and John instantly recognized the room he'd arrived in and left from before he'd been caught by Kyle and Derek. The place was just the same as he remembered moments before his capture. The walls were stained, the floor littered with debris, chunks of brick and plaster, and discarded junk. The whole place stank of mildew and decay. What caught the attention of Derek, Kyle, Allison, and Mac, however, was the hole in the ground. A smooth, perfectly formed half-sphere indented into the ground. "What the heck's that?" Kyle asked. "That's where I came through," John told him. Weaver stared at the walls and quickly located where she'd hidden the TDE in a corner opposite the hole they'd entered the room through. Her forearms turned silver and changed shape to the disgust of all the humans in the room save for John and Ellison, turning into pickaxe-shaped appendages. "Cameron," she beckoned and gestured at the wall. Cameron left John's side and stepped up to the wall beside Weaver. Weaver pulled her pickaxe arms back and struck the wall hard, gouging 2 holes in the wall and spreading cracks out like a spider's web. Cameron followed her lead and punched hard into the wall, sending out clouds of reddish-brown brick dust with each strike of her fist. The others just watched as the 2 cyborgs punched and struck at the wall, tearing it down piece by piece with each blow, until they'd pulled it apart. They stepped back when they were done, both completely covered in brick dust, and revealed the hidden chamber behind the wall. Inside was an array of machinery that John couldn't even begin to describe. An 8-foot metal cylinder filled the hole in the wall, probably taller, he thought, since he couldn't actually see the top of it. It looked like it ran right up through the ceiling and beyond. A metal cable as thick as his wrist coiled tightly all the way around it like a python constricting its prey, snaking up to the top and out of sight. "What is that thing?" Kyle asked, his wide open as he stared at it in curiosity. "Electromagnet," Weaver replied. "One of 4, she gestured to the other corners of the room. "Inside the walls, floor and ceiling are 6 superconducting rings." She pointed to the smooth crater in the ground. "One's under there," she told them. When the TDE is activated, it creates a sphere of supercharged electrons around the subjects inside. When it's fully powered, the machine creates a wormhole through space-time to the targeted date, and the sphere travels through. Derek stared at the contraption, realizing from Weaver's lecture that what he was looking at was only a piece of the whole. "How the hell did you build this?" "Time and money," she replied simply. She'd found it surprisingly easy to construct a TDE back in the past, where resources had been abundant. The technology required to build it was there. All that the humans had lacked was the conceptual design and a grasp of the physics involved. Skynet had calculated it all, and it had been a simple matter of implementing its own design, using the resources and tools available before Judgment Day. The difficult part had been creating it without attracting attention. More than one unfortunate employee had accidentally stumbled across its construction and never been heard from again. Weaver stepped into the hole in the wall and pulled out a thick plastic box. She opened it and pulled out a laptop and several cables. She opened up the laptop and turned it on, and they waited for it to load up. It only took 2 minutes to load, and she connected the wires to a port in a socket on the ground, at the foot of the electromagnet. She'd anticipated there would be damage to the TDE control interfaces and buried a backup inside the walls. She ran a diagnostic test first of all, to ensure nothing had damaged the time displacement equipment over the past 18 years. She'd built the machine to last, knowing it would remain unused for 2 decades, but she still had to make sure. "It will work," she told them when the diagnostic was complete. No damage to the equipment itself. It's crazy," Allison said quietly. "Now what do you think?" John asked Derek. "I believe you," Derek said, still in awe. But Allison worded it better. "This was just nuts. How could something like this even exist? Weaver's fingers danced on the laptop's keys as she activated all the TDE components. The engines that drove the machine, buried deep under the floor, started up with a low whine, and several LED lights on the electromagnetic cylinder winked on, causing a chill of anticipation to run through John's spine. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as he awaited the bubble to slowly form. The whining faded and died, as did the LEDs. "What happened?" Savannah asked. "There's no power," Cameron told her. That was the only explanation. "I thought you said Serrano Point was still online." John queried. "It is." Cameron had seen it through the UCAV's sensors, and the power plant was definitely operational. Weaver checked everything once more and ran several more tests, taking a long while before she finally came up with the answer. "The underground conduits aren't receiving any power from the grid," she told them. Skynet still used some of the power infrastructure from before the war, namely underground power cables. They were intact, according to the tests she'd ran, but no power was forthcoming. "Skynet cut us off," Derek said. "Like the power or water company cutting off your supply if you didn't pay the bills." "It didn't want people using its power," Kyle added. "Doesn't want people being able to use electricity. It wants to keep us in the dark." Cameron knew that was true. Electrical power was an asset to people, powering communications, lights, manufacturing facilities. She remembered how General Perry in her future had coined it. Terminators can see in the dark and people are afraid of it. It was a simplistic statement, but it was accurate. "We can't use it then?" Ellison asked. This couldn't be happening. Their entire plan hinged on getting back to 2009. Without the time machine, there was nothing they could do. "Not without power," Weaver told them. John stood silent for a moment, trying to think of some way out of this, some way of getting the TDE working again. Skynet wouldn't need a time machine because it was winning. There was no way they could organize any real kind of resistance and turn the tide. "Not now." "It's simple," Savannah said. "We need power, and the only place that'll give us enough is Serrano Point. Let's just take it." "It's not a bad idea," John replied. "I'm not just a pretty face," Savannah grinned at him. John turned to Weaver. "Is it possible?" He asked her. "Reroute the power from Serrano Point to here." "No chance," Derek shook his head. "Serrano Point's got a legion of endos and its own airfield. It'd take an army to capture it." "How did we do it before?" John asked Cameron. "Guerrilla warfare, slow attrition of the plant's supplies and defenses," Cameron replied. "Then seaborne assault using the Jimmy Carter as a platform for TechCom commandos to secure Avila Beach." The battle had lasted all day and resulted in high casualties for the resistance. She recalled perfectly standing with John on the conning tower of the Carter, watching as inflatable raiding craft holding a squadron of TechCom special forces and reprogrammed T-888s sped across the sea in the dead of night to secure a beachhead on the plant's coastal flank as regular resistance fighters launched diversionary attacks from inland. A lot of humans died that day. "That's out of the question then," Mac said sullenly. "What's TechCom?" Kyle asked, curious. "Michelle to Reese. Come in, Reese, where the hell are you?" Derek pressed the comm button on his radio as Michelle's garbled voice came through in a haze of static. "We're fine, Michelle." "Wait one." John realized from looking at Derek and the others that he couldn't do what he needed to do to get back to 2009. He couldn't get the power from Serrano Point. Not alone, anyway. "We need your help," John said to Derek. "Why should we help you?" Allison asked. "Every time we've dealt with you, our friends have been killed." John paused for a moment, knowing painfully that it was true. Neither time was his fault. The Terminator that had attacked them had been sheer coincidence, but he knew they wouldn't have seen it that way. And the second time round they'd attacked him, Savannah and Ellison, forcing them to fire back and Cameron to bomb Kyle and Allison's squad. "She's got a point," Kyle agreed. "Because this isn't right," Ellison said. "You know this isn't how things were supposed to be, hunted down like rats by the machines. We can go back and change it." Derek frowned at that. Of course this wasn't how things were supposed to be. Machines shouldn't be ruling the world and people shouldn't have to live underground, fearing for their lives. Everything about the last 17 years was just wrong. "Because we'll take you with us," John added. That caught their attention, he noticed. 4 sets of eyes stared intently at him. "If you help us get power to this thing, you can come back with us, away from all this." "We don't need them," Weaver said. "They're expendable." "Nobody's expendable," John snapped back at her. What the hell was it with her? Derek thought long and hard about John's proposal. It seemed almost too good to be true. Going back to the past, paradise compared to this world. But what was the more dangerous? Venturing south to find somewhere remote where Skynet wouldn't find them, through unfamiliar territory to an unknown destination, or a 300-plus-mile round trip through Southern California to the power base of Skynet's forces in the region, which would undoubtedly be heavily protected, the frying pan or the fire. A suicide mission either way, he figured. At least if they somehow succeeded and made it back to the past, they'd never have to worry about Skynet finding them. "We can all go back?" Derek asked. John simply nodded. "And you say you can stop Judgment Day before it happens?" "That's the plan," Savannah said. Derek nodded slowly, realizing it was their best chance to escape the war for good. "We're in," he said, "but we've got to sell it to the others." He wouldn't make anyone join in on this mission. He'd give them the choice. "I'll stay here," Weaver told John. "Serrano Point alone won't provide enough power at once. I need to create a buffer to build up the charge." It was the only way the TDE would work, but it meant it would take time to build up, and if John insisted on bringing back more unnecessary, irrelevant passengers with them, it could put considerable strain on the time displacement equipment. It wasn't designed to be used multiple times in quick succession. "You do that," Savannah said as she stepped out of the room, taking point as they all began to filter out of the basement, leaving Weaver working on the TDE. "Savannah," John said as he and Cameron were the last to leave the room. "Give them their weapons back." Savannah pulled the plasma rifle she'd had slung over her back and raised her eyebrow at John. "You sure?" she asked. "It won't look too good if we show up with them at gunpoint," John said. He didn't want to risk breaking this fragile alliance even before it got started. Savannah hesitated as Derek reached out for the weapon. "Mind if I take a shot first?" she asked. "I've never fired one before." "Sure," Derek shrugged. Savannah hefted the heavy weapon and pulled it close to her shoulder. The thing was much heavier than her HK-417 and felt too bulky and clumsy in her small hands. Better have a hell of a punch to be worth it, she thought. So far, she wasn't that impressed by it. She pointed it at a section of brick wall down the tunnel, took aim down the jury-rigged, tacked on iron sights at a spot perhaps 50 feet away, and pulled the trigger. A blue-white plasma bolt shot out of the barrel with a high-pitched shriek and struck just to the right of where she'd aimed. The brickwork exploded in a puff of dust and shattered bricks, and a jagged black hole the size of a dinner plate had been punched through the wall. There'd been practically no recoil, Savannah noted. Still, the spot she'd hit was wide of where she'd aimed. "Not very accurate," she commented. "How many shots do you get out of this thing?" she asked Derek. 50, Derek answered. 49 now. She lowered the weapon and handed it to Derek, something coming to mind she wanted to test. When she, Ellison and John had fought against these guys. They hadn't scored a single hit with a plasma rifle. First, she'd thought it was just blind luck, but now she wasn't so sure. "Shoot through the hole I made," she told him. "What's going on?" Allison asked. "Just testing a theory," Savannah said. She nodded to Derek. "Do it." Derek decided to humor her and took aim, hugging the butt into his shoulder and holding the weapon with more comfort than Savannah had. He fired once. The bolt burnt through the air and struck the wall to the right of her shot. She went up to the hole and felt the heat emanating off where the second shot hit. The edges of the bricks were still glowing a faint, almost molten red. It was a good 4 inches wide of the hole she'd blasted with her shot. She went back up to Derek and snatched the rifle out of his grasp, causing him to stare at her in confusion. "What the 48 shots now?" she said as she crossed over to Cameron and handed her the plasma rifle. "She can make them all count." "Thank you," Cameron smiled slightly at Savannah. She understood her point. The plasma rifles were designed to be used by Terminators and autonomous infantry units, who had inbuilt targeting systems and didn't need to use sights or scopes. She handed her HK-417 and ammunition to Savannah, who then passed it in turn to Derek. "Great," he mumbled, not at all pleased with having to swap his plasma rifle, but he wasn't going to risk his neck trying to get it back from Cameron. This was the first Terminator he'd ever seen that hadn't tried to kill them on sight, and he didn't want to risk changing that by pissing it off. He turned to John. "We need to get going," he said simply. John looked at the Metrorail station Derek, now called home, since they'd moved from the tunnel he'd fled, seeming like a million years ago now. He'd counted only 10 people left, including Derek, Kyle, Allison, and Mac. That Terminator attack had really done a number on them, he thought. There'd been close to 30 of them living in the old tunnel during his time there. They needed to get back as much as he did, he realized. 30 people down to 10. A clear sign if any that people really were on the brink of extinction, and Skynet was close to winning this war. The few people who were left were in a frenzy of activity. 10 army-style rucksacks were lined up alongside a wall at the bottom of a flight of stairs, plus webbing and pouches, and several duffel bags and rifles laid out. "Were you planning on going somewhere?" Ellison asked. A tall woman with dirty blonde hair stared at John for a moment before regarding Allison. "We were going to break out while Skynet's forces are distracted and head south into Mexico." "You won't make it," Cameron told her, earning a scowl from the woman. She was accustomed to being feared and hated, and knew it wasn't only because she was a machine, but because she was a copy of Allison. Humans took exception to themselves being copied. Strange, she thought, because she'd once heard that imitation was a form of flattery. "We've got 2 cars we've managed to get working," another man said to Cameron and John, carrying a pair of large plastic cans filled with water and setting them down beside the packed rucksacks. "Full gas tanks, too. Took us a while to find the fuel." "She's right," John gestured to Cameron. "You wouldn't make it down to Mexico." The smell of cooking meat drifted down from up the stairs to the floor above. It meant nothing to Cameron, but she could see John's nostrils flaring, and he licked his lips. Kyle descended down the stairs, stopping at the bottom and looking to John. "Dinner's ready," he told them. John and Cameron went up the stairs to some sort of communal area. There was no furniture at all, and people entered and sat down in small groups. Since the group had arrived back at the station, Kyle and Allison had started preparing a meal on Derek's request. Kyle and Allison carried a large pot of hot, bubbling liquid into the room and set it on the floor, then went back into their impromptu kitchen and brought out a steel barrel. "What's for dinner?" John asked, dreading to find out. His diet had been pretty much just dog and the occasional rat, since coming through to the future, and he had a feeling he'd eaten well compared to a lot of people. This was going to be our last meal before we'd set off south, so we'd wanted to make it special, Kyle said. Wild boar, Allison got straight to the point. Catching the thing had been a lot of trouble, but it had been worth it. This could well be the last meal any of them ever had, so they'd wanted it to be better than the garbage they'd eaten for dinner every day for as long as she could remember. Guess it's as good a last meal as any, Savannah said, her nostrils flaring slightly as the smell wafted to her. It smelled pretty damn good. Everyone took out mess tins, spoons, and steel mugs, and filed into a queue for the food whilst Mac handed out ceramic bowls to John, Savannah, and Ellison, notably leaving Cameron out. John noticed. I'm guessing you won't need one, Mac said curtly to Cameron. Cameron leaned into John and hovered over his shoulder, her lips an inch from his ear. Don't ask what else is in the stew, she said softly to him. Why? John asked, confused. You can't grow vegetables here, she explained, keeping her voice low so nobody else would hear her. She knew what went into the stews in the original future in the absence of vegetables. Algae had been a commonly used ingredient, as were insects. John looked at the pot and saw green things he'd thought were leaves, but now he wasn't so sure. He nodded to Cameron and decided it would be better if he didn't know. Sharing sweet nothings, are we? Allison rolled her eyes at Cameron and John as she spoke to him. She'd been half right, she thought. John and the metal were close. Too close. Even if the tin can was nothing to do with her from this timeline at least. From what they said, it was still creepy to see a person so clearly trusting of and close to a machine. If she had her way, she'd just grab a plasma rifle and blow it away, not be eating across from it. Savannah picked up the ladle and scooped a helping of the stew into her bowl and one for Ellison, and just stared at Allison. Jealous, are we? She commented, copying Allison's tone. How can you stand being around metal? Allison asked. Cameron's okay, Savannah said as she turned away to head back to Ellison. Makes better company than some. She made a show of looking Allison up and down, clearly emphasizing who she was talking about, then strode off and went back to Ellison, handing him his meal. You should eat, Cameron told John. He hadn't moved towards the stew, but she could hear the rumbling of his stomach and knew he was hungry. You want any? He asked her. He knew she didn't need to eat, but she could do so. He didn't know if she could taste it or anything like that. No, Cameron answered simply. She sat in place, whilst John got up and moved to the stew pot. Kyle and Allison spoke in hushed whispers, and the latter glanced over at John several times. He noticed her looking and figured they were talking about him, though he wasn't fussed what it was about, as long as they weren't planning to turn on them or anything. It looked more like they were debating or arguing something, though he wasn't sure what. John picked up the ladle and started to scoop the thick liquid into his bowl. He could see now that he was right at not wanting to know what else was in it. It smelt good, but it looked disgusting up close. Allison turned away from Kyle and approached John as he finished filling his bowl. I wanted to say sorry, Allison said quickly, not at all feeling comfortable with what she was about to say. For trying to kill you these past few weeks. And for thinking you're some kind of freak. Well, you are, sort of, because you came through time for that thing. Is there a point to this? John asked. He didn't want to hear a list of criticisms about him coming to the future for Cameron if they pulled this off. And they got back. He was sure he'd get an earful about it from his mom. Not that he cared. He'd made the call, he'd dealt with it, and he'd deal with his mom when the time came, too. I get it, he told her. I'd have probably thought you were working for Skynet too if you showed up, and a few days later a Terminator attacks. Not just that, Allison said. When I saw the metal in that coffin, I freaked out. I saw the way you stared at me when we had you and I put two and two together and thought the worst about you. John saw Kyle several feet behind her, talking to Derek and glancing occasionally at him and Allison, and figured he'd put her up to this. Whether it was because of Kyle himself or just trying to smooth things out for the road ahead, he didn't know. "I used to live in Palmdale," she told John. "My family survived J-Day, but 2 years after the bombs fell and the machines rolled forward, we were attacked." "Skynet?" John asked. Allison shook her head. "Tunnel rats. They came up to the surface to scavenge for supplies, and we had a cache of canned food and water enough to last the 4 of us for months. They killed my dad, took the food, and kidnapped my mom and sister. I hid, and I never saw either of them again." "You've seen any tunnel rats around?" she asked John. "Yeah," he nodded, thinking back to the derelicts back in the tunnel and the man he'd killed. He'd seen what they did with young girls and started to see what Allison had been afraid of. Chances were her mom and sister had been forced into sexual slavery, and she'd been afraid of him doing the same to her. It seemed far-fetched to him and more than a little insulting, but then again he'd only seen a small portion of what this future was like. She'd lived it all her life. "People with power take advantage of everyone else," she said. "We realized you were part of this group that was kicking Skynet's ass, making you one of the most powerful people left in the world, and that's what I thought you were gonna do. You've seen what people can do." John paused as he took it all in. She'd thought he was some kind of perverted sex fiend who was going to use her like a piece of meat. Bit of a change from being some kind of messiah, he thought. "All I wanted to do was find Cameron," he told her. "I never even knew who you were. She mentioned an Allison once, but I didn't think anything of it until I saw you in the tunnel. I've found Cameron, and all I want to do is go home." Cameron listened in on John and Allison's conversation and watched as he spoke to her, curious. Savannah beckoned Cameron over to her and Ellison, and she got up and joined the pair of them. She'd noticed that they'd remained separate from Derek's group. They were allied, but they weren't friendly. She sat down next to Savannah as she and Ellison spooned the stew into their mouths eagerly. "Hey, Cameron," Ellison said around a mouthful of food, swallowing it before he continued. "Have you thought about what you're going to do once we go back?" "Find Danny Dyson," she answered. "Stop Judgment Day." They knew the plan. "We mean after that," Savannah said between mouthfuls. "Let's say we manage to go back and we stop Skynet. Then what?" "I haven't thought about it," Cameron replied. All she was concerned with was protecting John. As long as she was with him and he was safe, she was content. "Not sure what I'll do," Savannah sighed. "John said you're a good fighter," Cameron said to her. "You could join the army." Savannah shook her head. All she'd ever done in her life was fight. "No, I want to do something else." Once they got back, and they'd stopped Skynet, she wanted to do something different with her life, not fighting. She didn't know what, though. "You'll think of something," Ellison said to Savannah. She was resourceful, tough, and resilient. If she set her mind to something, he knew she'd succeed. He turned to Cameron as he finished off the last of his stew and set the bowl down, content. "You'll need a plan," he said to her. "Even if we stop Skynet you, John and Sarah will still be fugitives. The police and the FBI won't stop searching for you." "That won't be a problem," Cameron smiled slightly. Her experiences with John Henry, his memories which were now her own, and her newly acquired capacity to wirelessly access machines opened up a number of possibilities. She could easily make her, John and Sarah, disappear permanently. Derek stood up from his spot on the floor, and the chatter amongst those eating quickly faded into silence. "I want to make sure everyone knows the score," he pointed to John, still talking to Allison. He and John had spent a lot of time hammering out a plan together, trying to work out the best way they could actually achieve this thing. "We can't stay here," he told them. "And recent events mean our plan to head south is now impossible." John stood up, knowing he should explain it as well, since it was his, Ellison's, and Savannah's plan. Well, their plan anyway. Before he could say anything, Michelle glared at John, and then Derek. Why the hell are we listening to this little bastard, Reese? He's the reason we're so screwed. Because we can take you somewhere safe, John answered her simply. You're talking about breaking into Serrano Point, a long-haired, scraggly fighter in his 30s commented. That's a goddamn suicide mission. We don't have any other choice, John told them. He gestured to Cameron. Cameron can help us. She can hack into the plant and scramble its security systems. And she's got 24 endos under her control. They'll provide a distraction while we infiltrate the plant. The same long-haired fighter looked at John, then Cameron, and his brow furrowed. I don't know. Working with one metal's bad enough. Now you're saying we gotta trust a whole bunch of tin cans. What if they turn on us? I trust Cameron more than anyone else here, John snapped back. He didn't have to worry about Cameron putting a bullet in his back or taking out one of Derek's men because she didn't like them. He couldn't say the same for any of Derek's group. He knew any of them would gladly blow Cameron away if they thought they could get away with it. Question. Kyle raised his hand politely, also trying to change the subject away from whether or not they should be working with machines. If Cameron can do all that, why can't she reroute the power from here? Don't call it that, Allison whispered irritably into his ear. It wasn't human. It shouldn't have a name. Cameron looked to him but didn't stand up. She ignored Allison's comment. She didn't care what Allison said about her, and she didn't want to cause further tension between the two groups. I can, but Skynet will stop it, she told Kyle. We have to stop them from manually diverting the power. It was high risk, but she calculated the odds of success from what she knew of Serrano Point in her timeline, and it had a much better chance than Derek's plan of hiding in the south. She decided not to mention that she expected heavy casualties. All of Derek's crew stared at Cameron as she spoke. They didn't want to hear anything a metal had to say, though Derek grudgingly had to admit she had a point. Putting it simply, we head as far north as we can underground until we leave LA County, head northwest up to Serrano Point, 160 miles away. The metal reroutes the power. We make sure the machines can't take control back quickly, then haul ass as fast as we can back here, get to the downtown basement where we found Connor, and go through back to the past. If it works, then, in a week's time, we'll be eating hot dogs and drinking beer back in 2009. Derek tapped the side of a metal barrel beside him. Help yourselves, he told everyone. He turned to John and quietly said, Moonshine. We brewed it a while ago and kept it for a special occasion. Might as well drink it down tonight. Derek took his canteen mug and poured himself a large helping, followed by the others. John turned away from it and went back to Cameron, Ellison and Savannah as Derek's group got stuck into the homemade alcohol. He could see their point. Given the danger of the mission, this could well be their last ever meal. They might as well make the most of it. You're all welcome to have a drink if you like, John told them. But I'm not. I want to keep a clear head for tomorrow. Ellison declined, thinking the same as John. Savannah looked at the barrel and the people milling around it, swilling booze down their necks. Fuck it, she said as she got up and joined the queue for the moonshine. She'd had a really shitty last few days since she'd set eyes on the liquid metal bitch. She could use a drink. It didn't take long before she was at the front, and she filled her mug to the top. She pulled it up to her lips and took a long swig. The probably wood alcohol burned its way over her tongue and down her throat, leaving a warm, bitter sensation in her mouth. She took another deep swig. It tasted like crap, but hopefully it would do the job. Take it steady, a tall, slender fighter with long, curly hair, piercing blue eyes, and a slightly crooked nose said to her with a slight grin on his face. That stuff's strong. This. Savannah lifted her cup as she drained half of it down her throat. I'd have to drink half the barrel to even feel it. As she took another sip, the fighter said something to her, but she just nodded, not really paying attention. She saw Allison and Kyle stood chatting, very close together, and tried to listen in on them. Allison and Kyle stood together and leaned against a wall, their shoulders just barely touching as they both slowly sipped on their drinks. Kyle gestured with his mug towards John and his group. "What do you make of them?" he asked Allison. "The old black guy seems okay," she shrugged. He hadn't said much, but seemed pretty reasonable when he did speak. "I don't like the girl, and the less said about the metal the better." "Are you ever gonna let that go?" Kyle asked her. "If we manage to do this, and that time Machine does what he said, then are you gonna obsess over her once we're back?" "It. Not her it." "It then," Kyle corrected himself. He looked over and saw John chatting to the Machine and Ellison. He looked genuinely happier now. Kyle could see a spark in his eyes whenever he spoke to the Machine. It was weird, freaky, and he didn't know what the attraction could be, knowing it was a machine. But whatever. It was Connor's choice, and as long as it didn't hurt anyone else, it didn't matter. He didn't exactly see them all being drinking buddies once this was all over. "We barely survived hunting, Connor. I don't want you risking your neck again because of a grudge. Life's too short." Kyle leaned into Allison and lowered his head down, brushing his lips lightly against hers. Allison realized he was right, especially in this world, and given the danger they were about to put themselves in. She pulled him closer and deepened the kiss for a second, until the sound of wolf whistles tore the moment from them, and they realized they were in public. "Come on," Allison got up and took Kyle's hand. She led him to the stairs that ran up from the platform to all their quarters. "This could be our last night alive," she told him, then planted another kiss on his lips. "Let's make the most of it. Break him in easy, Allie. It's his first time." Laughter erupted from the others at Mac's comment. "Best 10 seconds of your life, Kyle." Michelle hollered after them. John watched the banter and couldn't help but smile a little. They were in the shit, but they weren't wallowing in it like the tunnel rats. They'd made do as best as they could, and the fact anyone could still laugh and joke with the world falling apart around them was nothing short of a miracle in his eyes. It was a huge shock to him seeing Kyle, even though he'd accepted a long time ago that this Kyle wasn't his father with Allison, rather than his mom. He couldn't help but think she'd have something to say about the one person she'd ever really loved sneaking off alone with a Cameron lookalike. Cameron caught John staring at Kyle and Allison, disappearing up the stairs together like teenagers at a house party. John had spoken to Allison for several minutes, although she hadn't been able to hear all of the conversation because of background noise from the other people around talking much louder. She'd heard Allison apologize to John, and his acceptance of it, but little after that. She also saw how John watched the others, drinking and laughing together. He was always the outsider. He never joined in. She knew that of John. "Do you want to be with them?" she asked John. "With people, with Allison." John coughed in shock at her question. He hadn't been expecting that at all. "God, no," John blurted out as he cleared his throat. "Cameron, they kept me prisoner, and Allison nearly fed me to her dog. There's no way I'd want to stay with her or them." "Kyle's your father," Cameron said. "How'd you know that?" John stared at her quizzically. "I never told you that before." That had always been his most guarded secret. His mom had drilled it into him never to tell anyone. "You did," she replied knowingly. John caught on to what she meant. His future self had confided in her. She'd told him before they talked a lot in the future. He couldn't help but think he'd heard something in her voice, similar to whenever she'd spoken about Riley. Could she be jealous of something that didn't exist, even? "I'm not interested in her," John said. "At all. I'm happy for Kyle," he shrugged. He wouldn't say these people meant nothing to him, but they weren't his family by a long shot. He wouldn't have chased any of them through time to find them. "Looks like love is in the air," Ellison pointed to Savannah. The blonde guy was still chatting her up and stepping closer and closer until his body was inches from hers. He leaned in for a kiss, but Savannah swiftly pulled away and kneed him hard in the balls, doubling him over. He let out an agonized groan as pain racked his body. John felt his own testicles ache in sympathy for the guy. He'd been on the receiving end of Savannah's ball-breaking knee once before. "Maybe not," Cameron said as Savannah shoved the guy to the floor and the scene seemed to freeze. Everyone stared at Savannah for a second, completely silent. John felt an instant tension as all eyes fell on the redhead. Had she just ruined their alliance before it had even started? "You fucking idiot, Cooper." Michelle laughed at her downed comrade, and seconds later the chatter went back to normal, the incident forgotten. Savannah came back to Ellison, John and Cameron, and crouched down on one knee, swaying slightly as she sipped on her third mug of moonshine. Contrary to her earlier boast, it was definitely starting to take effect. "What was that about?" Ellison asked her, though he thought he could guess. Since he'd taken her back from the Mexican soldiers, she'd shacked up with she hadn't once gotten close to anyone. She never normally drank, either. Not until now, and he knew it was no coincidence it came only days after seeing Weaver again. "Came up with some crap about how it might be our last night on Earth, and we should make the most of it," Savannah said bluntly. The same shit she'd heard Kyle and Allison spout before they'd rushed off upstairs. John got up to his feet, as did Cameron. "I'd rather make sure this isn't our last night on Earth," he said. "So I'm getting an early night." John started towards the stairs that would take him up to the offices and small stores, hoping to find a vacant one he could set up in and get some sleep. He had a feeling the party down here would go on for quite some time. Cameron followed, as did Ellison. "I'm going to stay a while, I think," Savannah told them. She wasn't anywhere near drunk enough yet. "Have fun," Ellison told her. He'd learnt long ago that nothing would stop her once she made her mind up, and knew she could take care of herself. John turned to Derek just before he started up the steps. 9 a.m. tomorrow, he nodded to Derek, stood beside Mac and another fighter in the middle of an arm wrestling competition. Savannah watched with interest and nominated herself to take on the winner. "We'll be ready," Derek tilted his mug at John. John quickly made his way up the stairs, taking 2 steps at a time as Cameron kept stride with him and Ellison behind them. Drunken shouts and cheers flowed through the air as one of the 2 competitors finished the other one off. "I hope so," John breathed out a quiet reply to Derek. "I really hope so." Up the stairs, they found a corridor with a series of doors on each side. What used to be offices and utility rooms, Derek had told John. They were now living quarters, and because of the group's depleted number, they had plenty of space, and he'd told John to pick out a vacant one to sleep in. John didn't really like the idea of sharing rooms with Derek and his men. He was still uneasy around them. John reached for the handle of one door, but Cameron shot out her hand and grasped his wrist, pulling his hand away. "Not that one," she told him. Allison and Kyle were in that room. "Trust me," she said. She could hear everything happening behind the door. She led them to a vacant room at the opposite end from Kyle and Allison, and led them in. She'd placed their packs in this room before. John straightened out his roll mat and pulled the sleeping bag out of his pack, as Ellison did the same to his own rucksack, and then pulled out Savannah's sleeping gear, ready for her to get into when she returned. "She'll be too drunk to do it herself when she gets back," Ellison said to John. "Does she get drunk a lot?" John asked him. "She used to," Ellison replied, thinking back sadly to when he'd found her shacked up with the soldiers. She'd been hooked on alcohol and drugs, and it had taken him months to nurse her back to full health. She hadn't touched anything since then. Weaver's really gotten to her, he said almost apologetically. Is she going to be okay? Cameron asked. She liked Savannah. She now had all of John Henry's memories and was surprised at the stark contrast between Savannah as a little girl and her now. Savannah reminded Cameron slightly of Sarah Connor, and she was curious about her. At the same time, she found herself inexplicably concerned for Savannah's well-being. John took off his thick coat and thermal sweater underneath and pulled his boots off. He slipped into his sleeping bag as exhaustion got the better of him and zipped it up, wrapping himself in a warm, comfy cocoon as Ellison did the same and lay down. John closed his eyes and lay back as Cameron sat up beside him. Lay down, he told her. It's weird you sitting up like that. Cameron complied and lay down close beside him. Better? She asked. Much, he smiled, his face partly obscured by the sleeping bag. He wanted to stay up and talk to Cameron, but he was so exhausted, having barely slept in days, always being on the move, that he just didn't have the energy. Thanks, he mumbled, slurring slightly, already starting to succumb to exhaustion. He couldn't keep his eyes open anymore. For what? Cameron asked. John mumbled something unintelligible, and she couldn't understand a single syllable of his speech. He shifted in his sleeping bag and rolled slightly until he was leaning against Cameron, and his head was nuzzled into her neck. She could feel his pulse slowing down, as was his breathing. He was already asleep. He unconsciously mumbled something else again, and this time Cameron understood one single word he said. Her name. She reached her arm around him and wrapped it around his shoulders, edging him towards her so he was in a more comfortable position and wouldn't wake up with a sore neck. She liked the close proximity they shared and the trust he now had in her. They were closer than they had been before, and Cameron wanted that to continue. She looked at John, sound asleep and leaning into her. She was more content than she had ever been before now she was back with John, and Cameron resolved she would do anything and everything to ensure it remained that way.